Good afternoon, everyone. Andrew here from Accelerate. Just hitting 2 o'clock, opened up the room here for the webinar discussion. We'll wait for a minute and a half here for folks to join in. I know we have quite a number of attendees today, so looking forward to the conversation. Okay, seeing a few more join in. I know we have a number of attendees joining the conversation today or joining the webinar today to listen in on our conversation, and happy to have you here. I'll get started with my introduction. Andrew McKinnon, I'm the Director of Policy here at Accelerate, and happy to see folks on the line and happy to invite you all into the conversation today. Today, we're going to be talking about where are we going with the electric vehicle availability standard. Of course, a very, very hot topic in the past month. First of all, to introduce Accelerate, we're an organization that works across the EV supply chain here in Canada. Been around since 2022, and we work with about 50 different member companies and organizations that represent every segment of the supply chain. So we're working to advance that, looking at sort of, before the sales picture of EV, but we need to consider all these things at once. One thing that we're doing this year, very focused on looking at public sentiment and understanding of the EV supply chain from mines to mobility. So that's something that we'll weave into the conversation a bit today, and you'll hear some announcements from us going forward on our latest research on that. Today, we're talking about the EVAS, the Electric Vehicle Availability Standard, popularly known as the EV mandate. EVAS, we'll probably call it both. Was announced in 2022. The first regulated targets were set for 2026 at 20%. I think folks here on the line are pretty familiar with how it was developed, the history. A couple of the key figures, we saw the development of this major EV policy. And with that development, we saw as well the $20,000 investment for charging station units, the early action credits, sort of non-sales piece. So important to consider that. Something that Accelerate has been thinking about on the alternative compliance pathways. And if folks look back at the regulatory consultation from 2022, we can still see those comments from industry and others. And there was a lot of discussion at the time of alternative pathways. Can we buy credits from the government? Can we find other ways? So something to reconsider. Right now, as of September 4th, the government has initiated a pause and review of the EVAS. So we thought it would be important to have this conversation today to try to generate some ideas amongst all of you as you develop your submissions from your various companies, associations, and groups. And so that's the purpose today. And we want to keep it cordial. We have folks from you know, different perspectives on the issue. There'll be a Q&A feature in the webinar, but there's no open chat. So if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A. We have tried to incorporate all the questions that we received through the registration into our script for our speakers, who I'll get to in just a moment. Just turning to my notes here. So we talked about the EVAS a little bit of background there. You know, one thing I think is important to mention as well, that it falls under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And so, you know, failure to comply could potentially trigger some serious penalties. We talked about alternative pathways on credits. Some exists in the regulation. We want to get into that today. One other piece of context before I introduce the speakers, I just wanted to tie this in, and in the way that Accelerate has done is try to tie this in and talk about, what this means in terms of major project development, how we have a new government that is focused on nation building projects, developing markets for our critical minerals and developing that capacity to produce critical minerals. So with that, a little bit of background there on my end, I'll introduce our speakers. First, we have Yota Kokinos, who has 33 years of experience as a senior leader in Canada's public service, including as a Director General at NRCan. Yota now works with the Public Policy Forum and brings a very broad and a wealth of expertise on major projects development, energy strategy, policy development at the highest level, strategic planning, public sector management. So we're very happy to have Yota here and bring that experience. And then on the other hand, we have Stephen Beattie, who I think many of you know Stephen from his time at Toyota Canada. And Stephen served as the Vice President and Corporate Secretary at Toyota Canada. In the past year, he's been writing with the PD blog, which I think many of us have read and enjoyed some perspectives on Canada-US trade and auto. Stephen served various roles in industry over the years in Canada, in particular in the auto sector, working as chairman at the GAC, the Global Automakers of Canada. And having retired in 2024, we're still happy to have Stephen here today. So with that background for our speakers and a little bit of background on the subject area, I'm going to turn it to Stephen and Yota first to just give a little bit of their own perspective and their own background so folks on the line can understand a little bit where they're coming from. So maybe Stephen, we'll go to you first.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I'm delighted to be with you, and hi, everybody. My job, I think, is to be controversial, and Yoda's job is to be the smart one in the room with all of the policy answers. So let me start off by being controversial then. I have never been a proponent of zero emission vehicle mandates. And in fact, worked long and hard early on in this process to talk to both Quebec and BC in the development of their standards and said, look, I think one of the things that you guys are missing is that it is very difficult to have a standard that is built around industry regulation when it's actually consumers who are determining how the marketplace is going to behave here. And two, understand that there are actually three emissions regulations which govern transportation, not just one, and that if you don't control all of them at the same time, then you're going to get some perverse outcomes in the marketplace. So as we move forward, what I think you might find surprising is that my position has evolved a little bit, because once we have a regulation in place, the alternative to a regulation that isn't hitting its targets isn't to have no regulation at all. It's to amend the regulation in ways that can make it successful, that harvest the advances that you've made so far, and particularly at a time when the U.S. is busy looking at rolling back standards. I think Canada needs to have a very active debate about where we're headed, what it is we want as a nation, and how to ensure that we stay on the track. And bluntly, I have never encountered a consumer who's walked into a car dealership and said, "Hey, I want to use more energy or have it cost more." So for me, making the right choices, getting us on the right technological curve, and ensuring that we can do this in a way that not only encourages consumers to make the right choices, but actually sort of meets them where they are, is going to be very important. So I think we're going to get into all of those issues. The one last thought that I'd like to leave at the opening of this is, Andrew, you made the point that EVAS is set up under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and the industry has a lot of experience of working under SEPA, but it is an environmental standard. And I think
Mhm.
somewhere over the last few years, we got deeply into the discussion around mines to mobility or minerals to
Mhm.
mobility. And the problem with that is that if you take what is essentially an environmental standard and then try to graft other types of public policy onto that, again, there's the opportunity for you to miss all of your targets simultaneously because
Mhm.
either you don't have the right mix in the supply chain at the right time, or the environmental targets that you're after are different from the industrial standards that you're trying to meet. And so again, I think it's important for us to have a debate about what it is we're trying to achieve here and whether or not, even with a revised EVAS, whether there are other tools or policies or standards that you should be applying in order to meet the industrial and other goals. So that would be my pitch at the opening.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I like where you ended off there. I think that that's right where we'll pick up on our conversation. Yota, let's turn it over to you. I'd like to hear some of your background on this subject.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for the invitation to today's webinar. And Stephen, it was a pleasure to meet you for the first time last week, and really pleased to be doing this webinar with you today. And we're quite like-minded, having listened to your opening in terms of how to be thinking about the current EVAS and where we might want to take it. I'm going to just step back a little bit and kind of put this in a broader policy perspective. From my experience in government, whenever you embark on a journey to decide whether to keep a policy, modify a policy, or scrap it altogether, you really need to go back to first principles. What was the intent of the policy in the first place? What's the behavior you're trying to change? And what outcome you're trying to achieve? Then you need to look at whether this is the best tool to achieve that outcome. And here, I mean least cost and with the least externalities. And you need to look at how it fits into the broader scheme of policies that you have in place. Need to ensure that policy coherence across the suite of policies for what you're trying to achieve. And of course, you need to look at the broader economic context and the geopolitical environment when you're thinking about introducing something new that will affect the market. So I expect this is what my former government colleagues are doing right now as they
Mhm.
look at EVAS and how to modify it, or if to modify it or scrap it altogether. I expect that they are thinking about how it fits into the broader climate competitiveness strategy that is currently being
Mhm.
developed and the even broader industrial strategy that Minister Joly is unveiling today in Toronto. Um, so this is what would have happened at the time that the policy was launched. And I think this is what is should be happening again as they look about what to do with it. EVAS is, as we know, a legacy policy of the Trudeau government, and it is right now part of a suite of emission reduction policies that are all being looked at in light of things, the environment that has changed. And we know that a lot has changed since 2022 when this regulation was introduced. Globally, most economies are continuing to place a priority on emissions reduction and net zero emission policies, as this government currently does. But we have our trading partner to the south going in a completely different direction.
Mhm.
And that matters for a regulation like EVAS because it doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in an integrated North American market for autos, which is seriously at risk right now, especially if anyone watched, I'm sure we all did, the Carney visit to the US. The messaging coming out of that meeting is a real, it's stark. It's stark.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it's a real take pause moment. I would also add affordability has become a major issue for consumers since this policy was launched. And of course, it has affected EV uptake. Um, Canadians will only switch, I always say Canadians are only going to switch when the real world, the two EVs, when the real world barriers are addressed. And that's range anxiety, the lack of EV infrastructure, and the higher upfront cost of EVs. So until EVs offer the same convenience, affordability, um, and infrastructure that the combustion engine cars provide, we're not going to see a dramatic uptake. So all this needs to be thought together at the same time. The pace and speed of policies like the EVAS, it all needs to be thought of in an integrated and coherent way as the government goes forward to develop its new strategies around climate and the broader economy.
Thanks, Yota. Yeah, that's very much touching on a few of the issues I think we'll dive into today. And as I've been discussing this content of the webinar with Matthew, our president here at Accelerate, and others on the team, it sort of starts to emerge as this arch question on, the Canada-US relationship and where do these policies fit into that? And, looking at the names on the attendee list now, many of my former GAC colleagues and folks in the auto industry are fully aware of sort of the integrated nature of the market here. Before we get into that, I just wanted to turn to this sort of policy question again, right? And when we've been hearing about the EVAS, and I know there's public positioning on every side of this issue, but the way that we look at it now, it certainly seems that without a pause, we would be going into 26 and beyond, um, and there would be a failure to meet the targets. It seems that the targets would not be met. We know that, with the early action credits and the charging station or the charging credits, it doesn't exactly line up of sales on the ground with the actual 20% in the year. But what we heard is that, eventually you're going to get to a point where through ratios, you have to restrict ICE sales to comply and avoid the SEPA penalties. And it starts to get this winners and losers lens. And so you have some winners who will succeed under the mandate, and then you have losers who will have to pay and they will have to lose money on other sales. And so is this appropriate to look at winners and losers lens for a major public policy on a major part of the Canadian economy? So is a winners and losers approach right? Do we need to design policies so that there are always ways to produce winners? Or is that not strong enough? Maybe I'll turn to Yota first and Stephen can chime in.
Well, this is one way to look at it, and here the consumers are the losers and consumers vote. So that's one way to look at it. The policy won't have much durability. But I would say that if you look at the EVAS where we are right now, I mean, I would really say it's a failure as a policy, right? It goes back to the policy intent. If the intent was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it's failed. If it was to sell more EVs, it's failed. If it was to pressure the industry to produce more affordable cars, it's failed because we don't have a suite of more affordable cars that can compete with a BYD from China, for example. Um, so um, I think we really need to look at, I don't think anyone's going to argue with where we want to go. We absolutely, as Stephen said, we absolutely want to reduce emissions, but how we get there at the speed that we get there, um, you have to be careful about how all the different policies that you choose to put in place work together so that one isn't working against the other.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and that goes to that policy coherence point again.
Stephen?
Yeah, well, it's all of that. Plus, I think we need to zoom out a little bit. I think, as a society, we've been talking broadly about, the massive electrification of our economy.
Mhm.
And so often when we get into this discussion about, well, can everybody drive an EV? Um, well, most people could drive an EV, and many people will benefit from an EV, but not everybody. And if we were to make the transition really rapidly, there's enough capacity in Canada or near-term build capacity in Canada to handle the electrification of transportation. There isn't the capacity, nor is there the capital investment strategy to handle transportation plus housing plus industry plus a burgeoning AI sector plus plus plus. So at some point, as we start talking about those major projects and where Canada is headed, we actually do have to prioritize. And this goes to this question of winners and losers. I don't think that you're necessarily a loser because you're not, red circled by the government for special attention. I just
Mhm.
think that Canada has to set its priorities, decide where it's going to put its resources, and then all the rest of us have to take that data and understand how it impacts our sectors. I think when it comes to transportation and energy, for quite some time going forward, we're going to have both a pipes and wires strategy. We
Mhm.
can't do everything at once. So the question then becomes, how do we make this transition? So back to first principles. If this was about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then we would have had an open trading environment where vehicles from around the world came to the Canadian marketplace and were tested in the crucible of public opinion, right? If people are willing to pay money for the car, then there it is. And so long as it met the environmental requirements, then that should have been enough. But at the same time that all of this was happening, and of course, before we had a first year of implementation of EVAS, then we decided that there were larger geopolitical issues at play here, and we slapped 100% duty on Chinese vehicles, and not only on vehicles, but on the batteries and related supply chain that was going to be necessary to produce cheaper, longer range vehicles here in North America until the local supply chain could get up and running. So, the policy has morphed several times as we've gone on. And to Yoda's point, we need to go back to first principles and say, all right, what are we trying to achieve here? I believe that EVAS was conceived as an environmental measure. And I
Mhm.
think that's the right place for it to be. And the industry has a lot of experience in competing in that space, particularly in greenhouse gas and tailpipe emissions, right? And remember that, in all three of those regulatory spaces, you have tradable credits. So it's not just an issue of has an individual company got its ZEV credits lined up? They may very well have generated a surplus of GHG credits, and that's all a regulatory basket of costs or benefits that companies take
Mhm.
into their planning. So I think if it's just an environmental standard, then we can all figure it out. If it's something else, then that's an issue. And obviously, the Canadian government didn't ask to get involved in a trade war with the United States. And here's the thing that further complicates this issue of an electric vehicle availability standard, that standard is geared toward domestic consumption of vehicles. But we keep talking about the survival of an industry that is the second largest contributor to Canadian exports, but 85% of what's made here in Canada gets shipped to the United States. So
Mhm.
it's pretty clear that as we go forward, if the idea is how to build up the supply chain, how to create a competitive manufacturing industry, then we're going to have to set a different set of regulations and policy tools to be able to make that happen. I may be hammering this point too hard, but I think it's really important for us to say, all right, let's line up all of those public policy objectives we're trying to achieve, and then set the right tools in place to be able to get there.
Mhm.
On environment alone, if this is going to be a consumer-led charge, here's what I know. I was largely responsible for introducing Prius to the Canadian marketplace way back when. And we did a lot of work around the country. We were selling in North America electric vehicles at the same time. And the basic feedback we had was that if we inconvenienced people at all, then they wouldn't adopt a new technology. They wanted things which seemed familiar
Mhm.
and were easy to adopt and didn't cost them more. In fact, from an environmental standpoint, they saw that as a responsibility of the manufacturer and something that they shouldn't have to pay for. So I don't think that a lot has changed in the public mindset here. We need to have
Yeah.
vehicles that are well priced, that perform well, and that for Canadian consumers who tend to be pretty conservative, that they're not asked to place tens of thousands of dollars on something that they don't really yet quite understand or have confidence will hold its value over time. I think if we allow if we allow policy to recalibrate to more organic growth in Canada, we can get those technologies into consumers' hands in ways that will prove out, that will have advocates of consumers talking to each other and really accelerating the pace of electrification of transportation. But if you start to force people, or if they think that somehow you're taking their freedom of choice away,
Yeah.
consumers don't tend to be very friendly to that type of an approach. So let's think our way through this.
Yeah, a couple great points there. Appreciate that. And I think, we're talking a little bit supply chain. We have a few questions on that coming up. And the next one though is kind of the most popular with folks in the registration of the webinar, is talking about the GHG rules and how that interacts with the EVAS. And I think it's a great question. Why do we need both? Why do we need an EVAS to bring supply of these non-emitting vehicles to market when we have a G regulation that pushes cleaner and cleaner fleet performance? You know, I think again we're getting back to that arch question of, are we dictating our policy by the US? And I know we're adopting by reference those GHG rules. So if in the US they're going completely off the rails with GHG performance, does that not mean we need the EVAS even more now to ensure that we keep the fleet clean if the GHG rules are not going where we want to go as a country? Maybe you can go to that first, Stephen, and then back to Yota.
Okay, I'll try to keep this one brief, but two points. As I said to Quebec way back when they were introducing their ZEV standard, if you don't deal with GHG at the same time that you're dealing with ZEV, then you run the risk of pushing small fuel efficient vehicles out of the marketplace in favor of large, heavy, energy consuming vehicles, whether those are gas powered or electric, because that's
Mhm.
where the industry makes its profit margins. So, the result of it is that if you have a regulatory cost that's going to be taken on board by the industry, the industry needs to find the revenues to be able to reduce its liabilities, and you will see a natural shift in the types of products that are being provided. Now, with respect to regulation going forward, you're absolutely right that Canada adopts by reference US standards on GHG, except when we don't. So right at the moment, we're referencing a US standard, but it's not the current US standard.
Hmm.
So Canada and the US are on different curves. The problem for Canada is that our curve runs out as of 2026. So no matter what we do here, not only are we going to have a dialogue about EVAS and where it goes, we're also going to have a debate about GHG. And frankly, this is not going to be an easy conversation when the US seems to be intent on rolling back its standards. And I just remind everybody that we've got a minority parliament. So there are going to be a lot more voices involved in this dialogue about future environmental policy than has been the case in the past. So I think we're in for an interesting debate. I think we need to walk very carefully through the landmines associated with this. But as I said, I think I can't imagine there's anybody on this webinar that doesn't believe that we should continue to make progress. So, how do we do
Hmm.
it? And how do we get a big enough tent so that we have a dialogue where people are prepared to make compromises in order to move forward? The problem, frankly, in the past, particularly around EVAS, is that you had positions that were so hard and so polarized that there was no room for compromise. And I just don't think that today's politics are going to allow for that.
Yota, any comments there?
Yeah, I would just make a couple of points, and Stephen is bang on all fronts. If the intent is to reduce GHGs, then we really have to question whether the EVAS is the tool. Because if the intent really is to reduce GHGs, then we really should be buying Chinese BYDs. I was in Norway last year, and when you go to Norway, the one thing that you are struck immediately when you're in Oslo is one, how quiet it is. Why? Because the EV penetration there is like 80% or
Hmm.
more. And if you look around at what kind of cars they're driving, a lot of them are BYDs. So I get why we are restricting, question the 100%, but we want to restrict Chinese vehicles because our domestic market isn't there yet. And we would be shooting ourselves in the foot when we're trying to build a domestic market. But if GHGs is the pure objective, then I don't think the EVAS is the tool. And we do need to, and I think we're going to talk about this a bit later, but we do need to look at to what extent we want to protect our domestic market,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
by overprotecting our domestic market from a competition perspective, it's not going to push our domestic
Hmm.
manufacturers to more quickly evolve the technologies to reduce emissions.
Yeah, excellent. And I think we will touch on that subject later. And I think just before I move to our next question, I wanted to address Stephen's kind of comment on the polarization of the issue. And I think that this is, for better or worse, in the last year, Canadians from all sides of different issues are coming together and trying to adopt a Team Canada sort
Mm.
of approach. I mean, we all watched the the Blue Jays yesterday, and it's this is a Team Canada approach, and what we've seen in some of our polling at Accelerate, and you know, I feel maybe it's being somebody from Windsor and from the auto industry sort of heartland, a little bit. Uh, hurt that folks don't understand the importance of auto manufacturing and the auto industry throughout this country, right? We know it's a traditionally Southern Ontario and Quebec industry, but I think that, we talk about national champion industries and nation building projects. This could be it, right? Building the electric vehicle or building the future vehicle supply chain. Now, does that necessarily link into a sales mandate? I'm not sure. And so this is part of our next question, a little bit on supply chains. You know, we know we have the minerals and materials for batteries. We know there's a focus on this in the past few years. Of course, this is the impetus for Accelerate, why we exist, why we bring conversations with miners and battery technology developers and critical materials and materials processors together with the auto industry. And we're talking a lot about industrial strategy today. We talked about Minister Jolie's announcement and that sort of thing. Now, on the one hand, I'm hearing, one policy needs to have one objective. If we want GHG reduction, let's aim for that. If we want EV supply, that should be something separate. Now, I'm a little interested though to think, can we do two things at once? And in the EVAS, we know there's incentive or there's a pathway to invest in charging infrastructure. It's been used by manufacturers to help meet their compliance targets. And this is what we've heard on our side a little bit is, well, can we invest in the EV supply chain? Does that help under this regulatory model? Yota, I know at the Public Policy Forum, you have your Build Big Things playbook. Will, my colleague, is going to drop that in the chat for folks. And so I'd like to hear your perspective. Like, on one hand, we know, we want multiple objectives being met by individual models or policies, but how does Build Big Things and how do we think, and with how incredibly complex the issues facing the country right now, how do we kind of walk and chew gum at once? Is this something we should be considering in this framework? And what does your research have to say about it?
Yes, thanks, Andrew. So the driver for the Build Big Things report wasn't necessarily the EV battery supply chain, but it fits in quite nicely when you think about the supply chain includes the critical minerals that go into the batteries that we want to develop here in Canada. So just to put the report into context, we all know that Canada has all the ingredients for a competitive EV battery supply chain. We know the mineral resources. We always talk about the skilled workforce. We have the clean power, and we have proximity to the US market. But having the potential isn't the same as taking the steps to realize that potential. We keep saying we have the critical minerals that the world needs, but a lot of them are still mostly in the ground. So what the PPF set out to do was to look at what it's going to take to unlock investment in energy, critical minerals, and enabling infrastructure in order to get critical minerals projects to final investment decision and faster, so that Canada can actually realize its potential. These sectors are strategic assets for Canada, and we haven't really been looking at them in this way. And we haven't looked at not only how they can feed into an EV supply chain, but what can it mean for Canada's economic growth? And what does it mean to ensure that domestic critical minerals resource for our domestic manufacturing industry? So the PPF went out and consulted across Canada with a broad range of stakeholders in the energy, critical minerals, academia, financial institutions, civil society. And we asked this question, and we wanted to really drill deep into what's it going to take to unlock investment. And really, four things came together for us that turned into a bit of a framework that if you can bring all these four things together, you could really go a long way to unlocking investment for critical minerals. I'll keep it at that in this context. So the first thing was coordinating the financing. We know that these projects are in the billions, large capital stacks required to develop these projects. Governments have an important role to play in de-risking these capital-intensive projects. Our experience has showed that if government puts some money on the table, especially for the earlier development phases of a project, it does de-risk it. It does attract more private capital. So what we talk about is, okay, I think we all agree we need to get government to put something on the table, but what does it look like? And right now we have a disparate set of funding programs, funding agencies, and other tools. What needs to happen is, as a federal government, we need to coordinate these financing tools and bring them to bear on a very project-specific level and look at what the least cost to the taxpayer can we bring to the project to catalyze that kind of private sector investment. It could be a grant, but it could be low-cost financing. It could be loan guarantees. It could be tax incentives. So bottom line, really important to coordinate that financing, and not only at that federal level, look at bringing in provincial funding as well. Secondly, we heard all about regulation. So that second pillar is all around governments at both levels needing to ensure an efficient and effective regulatory regime, one project, one review. We talked about a 2-year timeline. The federal government has definitely bought onto this and is proceeding in that fashion, so we are hopeful. The third ingredient was enabling infrastructure. Mines and battery plants don't get built in isolation. You really need to look at a project from a systems approach and think about what's the power, the roads, the rails, the ports that are going to be required to make this project happen. You know, we heard a story, which you may have heard about, you know, the Ring of Fire. Everyone's been talking about the rich critical minerals in the Ring of Fire, except there is no shovel in the ground at the Ring of Fire. Why? Because the federal government and the provincial government have been fighting for years about who's going to build the road to the mine. That's just one example of what has stalled that project. I'm sure there are many more. Okay, so the importance of taking that systems approach, and part of that, it's not only the infrastructure that you're going to need, but the people infrastructure too. Are you going to have the skilled labor required to build these projects? That needs to fit into the equation as well. And finally, Indigenous economic participation. We know that to get these projects built, especially because they are now in more northern, more remote parts of Canada, it's not enough anymore just to consult with Indigenous peoples. You have to engage the rights holders and look at equity partnerships and other arrangements, procurement contracts, things like that, and make them a real meaningful part of the project. So we developed this framework which you can apply across the subsectors. And in addition, based on this framework, we also developed 10 essential plays. And we felt that we really wanted to put, the 10 essential plays are specific policy actions needed to accelerate this projects to final investment decision. And we felt strongly about the need to really push hard on critical minerals. Because of all the subsectors, it seems to be that the mining projects are the ones taking the longest for a variety of reasons. So we set out a series of recommendations specifically on that. We talked about prioritizing the critical minerals needed for transition to low carbon energy, and these are the same ones needed for the battery supply chain, the need to increase collaboration with the between the federal, provincial and territorial governments around infrastructure, the need to boost critical minerals exploration and development, the need to support R&D and innovation, and to offset the price signal distortions. And we could talk as well around critical minerals because of China's dominance in the market. They really are distorting the price. There are some things we can do as a country, so we need to look at that. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in. I appreciate that overview, and I think there's a few different actors sort of in the civil society space and
Yeah.
in the industrial development space talking about these issues and it's kind of the hypocrisy of the Trump
Mm.
administration we've seen killing EV policies, but then going after critical minerals and I just want to refocus and think about this play for critical minerals and the
Mm.
most important downstream market for that right now is batteries for EVs, right? And how we looked when the EVAS was developed to drive investment where
Mhm.
folks didn't want to invest into the charging infrastructure. And now we have automakers in this country who've made significant investments into the EV supply chain. Should they be rewarded under the EVAS in the compliance pathways? Stephen?
So my answer to that would be absolutely not. And I don't mean that there shouldn't be incentives for people to invest. What I'm saying is I don't think it should be under EVAS.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
if
exactly.
you're running an environmental policy, make it about the environment. If you're running a trade and investment policy, then that's the place where you can start to build out the strategies that will help build the critical mineral sector. Um,
Hmm.
and it worries me, frankly, if you start thinking about cross subsidizing the two, that by sinking money into early development of a mine, then the industry can avoid meeting emissions targets. I'm not sure I
Yeah.
get that as being in the best interest of the country. On the other hand,
Hmm.
um, it is important. This goes back to this issue of what is the industry, right? The consumer
Yeah.
industry is supported by 20 odd companies from around the world who are busy trying their best to get Canadian consumers to part with their money for their various models. And back to Yoda's point, if this was just about trying to get the most comprehensive mix of vehicles, then we'd have a very different tariff strategy with China right
Yeah.
now. But let's leave that aside for a moment. I think there are ways for you to service the Canadian market with more Chinese product and to put bumpers around it in a way that that allows that to be safe and acceptable in the Canadian market. What won't be safe and acceptable in the Canadian market is Chinese investment in critical minerals.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's where, as we start to deal with this, these policy areas are diverging. And I have
Hmm.
argued for quite a long time now, certainly since January when Donald Trump threw trade on its ear, that it's time for Canada to start looking at an Auto Pact 2.0. And if we go
Yeah.
back to the good old bad old days of the Diefenbaker government when these Auto Pact tools of duty remission were first developed, what it allowed for was duty-free entry of certain goods based on the value added that you had here in Canada. Now, um, the federal government, in response to U.S. tariffs on automotive, have put duty remission programs in place here in Canada. But they did it in a sort of perverse and backwards way so that the duty remission entitlements that were built on the basis of your historic imports, not on the basis of what you were making here. Um, so I think there's some room for some fine tuning here. I also think that it's important to remember that when these programs were first developed back in the 60s, not only were vehicles qualified under the program, but your investment in powertrain technology was covered under the program. So if I take Volkswagen, for example, and their battery plant, I believe that battery plant today represents a modern iteration of powertrain technology. And frankly, if I were looking at Stellantis and their battery development, if I look at it on the books, they've got more capacity between them if they're totally built out
Hmm.
than either company will need. There's an opportunity here to attract further investment to
Hmm.
further develop that marketplace demand and to use our trade policies in ways that, give you duty remission in response for those sorts of investments. So I think there are clever ways of using trade policy to get what you need to get. And you can perhaps entrench them through this next round of negotiations with the US, because what we would be doing also happens to be in the best interest of the United States.
Mhm.
But but as I said, I think if we start mixing and matching different policy options, things will go off the rails pretty quickly.
Mhm.
Just a final
Mhm.
thought, though, on China. Chinese vehicles don't scare me. And in fact, if you think about it, even today, Canada's tariff rate on conventional Chinese vehicles remains unchanged. We're at 6.1%. And we're not seeing a great flood of Chinese vehicles into the market because they're really not particularly competitive in that space. Before the 100% tariff, the three largest importers of Chinese vehicles were all American companies. And it was, in fact, American companies that led the charge of Chinese imports into Mexico.
Mhm.
So, as we start thinking about what role everybody can play here, there may be better room for partnering of companies and technologies
Mhm.
rather than simply saying, all right, we want, XYZ company from China to have free access to the marketplace. And in fact, I don't think you want them to have free market access until you have dealt with some issues related to their disproportionate control over that supply chain, related
Yeah.
to cybersecurity and interoperability of vehicles and infrastructure. I think there's some things we have to address. So
Mhm.
that's not
Mhm.
a never China. It's just a hey,
Exactly.
if we're going to do this, then let's really think our way through these next steps. But trade policy, absolutely, you can use it, and that's the way to direct investment back
Investment.
into the sector.
And I think, we'll ask the question again, and this is something that came through in the webinar questions as well. Like, what do we do with these 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs? Is this completely at odds with the EVAS? Are they on a collision course? We even had a question come through the chat, in Nepal where there's 76% EV market share, what are they doing differently? And well, they have Chinese EVs that are much cheaper, more suitable to that market, and they don't produce vehicles, so they're not balancing the
Yeah.
needs of their trade policy and that sort of thing. So, Yota, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. We're sort of in the wrap up phase, but this is a big question.
Yeah, it's not dissimilar from Stevens, actually. Um, you just, again, I think you have to look at all the tools and how they're working together. You need to look at trade policy, how you're going to use that. Um, you talked about you mentioned, Andrew, critical minerals and the US going in a different direction. Why do they want the critical minerals? They don't want them for batteries. They want them for defense, right?
Mhm.
So they've got other things that they're more interested in, I think. Um, so I think we're just at that point right now. The ground is shifting under us as we're even talking. Um, all of these policies have to be rethought. We need to, as I said, think about how they work together and whether we are using the right tool. I'm absolutely in agreement with Stephen. I don't know why we're using a policy under SEPA for car manufacturers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It just doesn't seem to make sense to me. So it is a bit of a stock take right now and a rethink and a recalibration and an opportunity to move away from things that we know have failed. And, I think if we're honest, I think this one has failed.
Is there an opportunity to during this review, can we save this? Can we build something that will continue to provide predictability or continue to assure there is a certain number of EVs sold every year, or is it just we focus on the GHG?
If it survives, then I think you need to look at the speed at which you're pushing it forward or you're
Mhm.
expecting outcomes. And I do think you need to provide more flexibility,
Mhm.
especially around the credits for investments that would align nicely with what you're trying to do on the
Yeah.
critical minerals supply chain. Um, but it's a difficult test. It's a difficult test for this policy to pass, in my view, for it to go forward. It really is. And so we'll see. I'm very curious to see if it survives.
One question I think it's kind of interesting that came in through the audience, not to do too much of a curveball, but is there a way, and Stephen, I'd like your kind of thoughts to pick up there as well, but looking at the EVAS, as far as different sort of categories of vehicles, right? Should the EVAS consider better range to weight outputs, or how can it incentivize smaller vehicles or more affordable vehicles? Is that an extra piece in there that should be considered or not?
Okay, so if I can pick up on that, I grew up in the 70s. I hate to admit that, but we were going through oil shocks at the time. And the one thing that was drilled into all of us was that um, the cars of the day needed to really be stringently controlled by CAFE rules, right? You wanted to have vehicles that used the least amount of energy, in this case, gasoline, as possible. And that meant building smaller, lighter, and often less expensive vehicles.
Hmm.
And I think we have not optimized the policy under ZEV for achieving affordability, and I think is a real crunch issue for most consumers.
Yeah.
I think the other point in terms of is there a future here is my concern that um, I don't think you necessarily want to let this one go until you figure out what the alternative is.
Mm,
So
Exactly.
while I might change elements of the program in order to reflect today's reality, I would be reluctant to let it go unless there was a strong consensus on an alternative path.
Yeah.
And I would also say that, and it'll shock some people in the audience while I give kudos to Quebec. I think they've been very smart at doing exactly those things and saying, all right, well, we've been through this. We've looked at, we've pulled every lever we could, including massive incentives for consumers, and they were successful in getting take up, but it hasn't necessarily moved the needle as far as we need for, from an emission standpoint. We've got grid issues that we're having to come to grips with in Quebec, and it's pretty clear that we can't afford to continue the incentives at the rate that we've been giving them up. So
Mhm.
we're going to change the goalposts. And they did one thing beyond that, which I thought was genius, which was they invited the federal government to come along with them. So if we're looking at an EVAS review, I would say that it's really important that everybody have a good, strong look at what's happened in Quebec. Maybe their numbers are right, maybe they aren't, but the principles that they've employed, I think, are very important. This notion that Quebec and the federal government might be on the same page again would be fabulous.
Mhm.
And frankly, if you could get Quebec and the feds talking to each other appropriately, I'm sure BC would be willing to collaborate with that too. So a single national standard would substantially reduce the compliance costs associated with
Yeah.
zero emission vehicle policy. So again, I think there are things that you can do that will improve the policy, that will hold it for
Yeah.
a period of time while we work out what else needs to be done. But I don't think walking down the path that the Americans have walked or seem to be walking is right for Canada. And I'm sorry if I'm alienating any of my former colleagues, um, but I think as Canadians, we all understand we want vehicles
Yeah.
that meet our needs, that do so with the smallest environmental footprint possible. But it has to be affordable.
Yeah.
Canadians uh, aren't rolling in cash at the moment, so how do we make this work?
Yeah. And before I turn to Yota for a final comment, I would just say that I think we need to find a way to make it work. And I think, from a supply chain development perspective and a perspective of seeing the vehicles on the road that we want to be the downstream market for our materials and battery production industries, we don't want to fall behind the rest of the world as far as adoption. And so if we can figure out a way to make this work, let's do it. And this is the period to do it now. So I'm glad we've had this conversation to kind of think about some of these ideas. And I don't think there's an easy answer. And maybe looking at the provinces and that sort of thing. Maybe you can close us out with maybe a couple pithy final remarks.
I would say that Canada has so much potential on so many fronts. And um, part of realizing that potential is getting out of our own way, and collaborating better. I think the Quebec example is beautiful. The one that Stephen told us, if we have to keep the EVAS, let's go the route of Quebec. Um, and I really think this is an opportunity
Mhm.
with what's happening with the US. The fact that we're having to step back and rethink our entire economy. Let's do it right. And let's leverage all of these strengths that Canada has. We should be on top of the world.
Mhm. Mhm.
But even our own constitution kind of works against us because it creates a tension that doesn't allow us to move forward on things as quickly as we'd like to. So I just think this is as much as it's a moment of crisis, it's a moment of opportunity if we take the time to do it right.
That's perfect. I couldn't have said it better myself. And
Okay.
want to thank you both for your time today. I hope folks on the webinar enjoyed the conversation. It's many, many layers of this discussion, and I know everyone's going to be very eager to continue the dialogue on the EVAS, and we're all hopeful to see where things go. So appreciate your time again, and thank you for everyone in the audience for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.